Well, welcome to all the students who are part of the International Environmental Policy Program, Ocean and Coastal Resource Management Specialization. Katie, your lecture tonight is a part of a class for them, but it's also, this lecture is open to the public. So we'll have some members of the public here. Everyone, welcome to the Center for the Blue Economy Speaker Series. It also is part of the Environmental Justice and Sustainability Speaker Series. And our tradition is to read a land acknowledgement before we begin. And then I'll turn it over to Dr. Jason Skorse, the director of the Center for the Blue Economy and head of the academic program, the International Environmental Policy Academic Program, to introduce our speaker tonight. So before we begin, we start with a land acknowledgement. We're physically meeting in the indigenous tribal area known as the Achasta. We acknowledge the Esalen people, who are the first people of this area. We acknowledge the Rumsen people, who were those who came from the north pre-colonial contact. And these people jointly, with their separate cultures and language, have come to be known in the Monterey area, the Achasta area, as the Esalen, the Carmeleno, the Monterey Band, the Rumsen, the Chalon, the Ohlone, and the Costanoan. And these are the indigenous people of Monterey County. All of their tribal members are identified through our 2 local missions. However, the Esalen are not a federally recognized indigenous nation, and that needs to change. So with that land acknowledgement and acknowledgements to First Nations and their role, and to the students and their role in bringing environmental justice and issues of equity and issues to light. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And Dr. Jason Skorse, please go ahead, and I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. I'm really excited for tonight's talk. We in the Center for the Blue Economy, we have been really pushing living shorelines pretty heavily as a policy solution to a lot of climate adaptation issues. In fact, we've been pushing very hard for a $10 billion in coastal restoration in the Build Back Better plan that's final details being debated in Congress here. And so it's really great to go from the 30,000-foot view to a real grassroots project. And that's why we're really excited to have Katie Nichols with us, who's working down in Orange County on some really innovative stuff. We read an article about the project and then invited her. So Katie, thanks so much for joining us. And we're looking forward to seeing what your work is all about.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thanks everyone for joining. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about our Living Shorelines project in Orange County. And just an outline of my talk. Everyone can see it okay, my first slide there. So I'll talk to you a little bit about Orange County Coastkeeper and what I do, about living shorelines a bit in general. I know some of you are familiar. And then I'll discuss eelgrass and native Olympia oyster, which are our species that we're restoring, and focus a little bit more on the oyster restoration and how our program is a bit unique in that realm. Talk a little bit about successes and challenges, and then I'm hoping we have some time for some good questions and discussion at the end. If you have questions, feel free to write them down or type them into the chat, and we'll probably just cover them all kind of at the end, if that's cool. So Orange County Coastkeeper, we are a small nonprofit based in Costa Mesa, really close to John Wayne Airport, and we're part of the Waterkeeper Alliance. So that kind of started along with the Clean Water Act, and there are several keeper programs along the coast. And we're all connected in that our mission is all about clean water. So our mission at Coastkeeper is to protect the region's water resources so they are swimmable, fishable, drinkable, and sustainable for future generations. And you may have some keeper programs close to you. I know there was one in Monterey, and I think it's starting back up. But there's chapters in Santa Barbara and LA and San Diego. So several of us along the coast, as well as nationally, part of the Waterkeeper Alliance. So we implement that goal through a bunch of different programs. So we have an education program that brings students on field trips focusing on water quality. Every year, non-COVID times, we also do this big, huge ocean cleanup event If you can see the photo in the middle, we also do an aerial art. So the students come to the beach, many of them from inland areas, visiting the beach for the first time. So they do a beach cleanup and then aerial art, and that's called Kids Ocean Day. It's a really fun event that happens all along the coast. Our other education programs are focused on water quality, watersheds, taking students to marine habitats and looking at how to study water quality. We have an advocacy program. So one of our big issues is opposing a desalination plant proposed in Huntington Beach. So we've been fighting that quite a bit. We also have staff attorneys that work on specific litigation of Clean Water Act violations. So we do a lot of stormwater monitoring. So if polluters are in the area and we can figure out that they're polluting an area, we will suggest best practices. And if those aren't followed, or if we need to take legal action, then we actually have lawsuits as well. And then my program is focused on restoration of marine habitats and research. So that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. And living shoreline. So what is a living shoreline? So in California, our bays and estuaries and our coastline is super modified. Particularly in Southern California, it doesn't really look like what it would have looked like historically. We have seawalls, we have riprap, we have coastal armoring. And what that does is it loses a lot of that transitional habitat. And so living shorelines it's kind of a newer strategy to promote connectivity. So rather than putting in a hardscape, what can we do that's a more of a natural barrier and can provide a bunch of different benefits more so than a seawall? So living shorelines can increase habitat value, they can increase abundance of different species, and then they also provide the physical benefits as wave protection, reducing erosion, and providing an adaptation to rising sea levels. So if you see that top picture, if you have a seawall, with sea level rise, there's nowhere for those species to go. And in a lot of areas, we have what's known as coastal squeeze, where we have development, we have highways, we have roadways all the way up to the beach and the shore, and there's not a lot of room for adaptation. And what these living structures can do, if there's space, is they can provide room for things to migrate and hopefully provide, ecosystem benefits as well. So our Living Shorelines project targets two species, oysters and eelgrass, and they're known to have this symbiotic relationship. So they're mutually beneficial, whereas the bivalve or the oyster can provide enhanced water filtration and nutrient cycling, and then seagrass can provide oxygen and organic matter. So I know we're not in person, it's kind of hard to raise our hands and be as interactive as I like to be, but I have a little quiz for you guys. And so you can think about this question and either type it in the chat when you know, or just think about it and I'll tell you in a little bit. So what is eelgrass? Is it a type of algae, B, a type of kelp, or C, a flowering plant? I'll give you a minute to think about it. Maybe you all know. I see some answers in the chat. I'll give you 10 or 15 more seconds. So if you said C, you're right. It's actually most like a grass on land. It's not like a kelp or an algae structurally. It's much more like a land grass. So it's a flowering plant, actually. It's pretty unique. It's adapted to living underwater. And it has this really cool root structure called a rhizome. And all of that, I'm going to show you some pictures of it kind of up close. But that is really helpful in providing some of the ecosystem benefits that I'm going to talk about. It's kind of its unique root structure. And it performs these dense meadows in bays and estuaries. A lot of times tropical species, there's lots of different species of eelgrass and seagrasses. The one that we work on is called Zostera marina. There's lots of species of Zostera, but that's the one we're specifically targeting. And it provides a habitat. A lot of juvenile fish, juvenile lobsters, spiny lobsters we have here in California. We use it as a transition habitat or a nursery grounds that forms some protection. It improves water clarity. It also can provide some wave attenuation or kind of slowing down waves. It stabilizes the sediment through that root structure I was talking about. And because it's a photosynthetic plant, it also produces oxygen. It's a food source, and it helps in carbon sequestration. I don't know if you guys have studied ocean acidification yet, but one of my recent projects was looking at eelgrass and its potential to buffer pH. So as we have more atmospheric carbon, eelgrass is being proposed as one solution to help avoid ocean acidification or that pH getting really acidic. So it's really important for all these benefits and for combating ocean acidification. So super cool. We love eelgrass. How do we restore it? So the picture on the right shows you that big, long rhizome root structure. And what we do for our method is we go down, hand collect it from healthy donor beds, being careful that we're kind of taking from different places and not disturbing a healthy bed. We go down, collect it on scuba very carefully to try to not disturb everything but mud. It's a very messy process. I kind of call it like underwater gardening. As soon as you put your hands down, mud goes everywhere. You can't see anything. But we can bring it up to the surface, and then we have volunteers on land bundle it. And you can see hopefully in that bottom picture, we use like a thick tongue depressor, almost like a popsicle stick, and hemp string to bundle it together and then provide like a sand anchor, where then that popsicle stick basically gets anchored into the mud. The hemp eventually biodegrades, and then the eelgrass has enough of a hold to kind of take hold, we hope. Our initial goal for the project was 1,280 square meters over 4 sites. And we first did the eelgrass planting for this project in 2015 and 2016. But Coastkeeper was looking at different methods for restoration and how best to do it in the bay, what worked, what didn't work for several years kind of prior to this project. So hopefully we found the best method that would work for this area. And the oyster. So the oyster species that we're talking about is the Olympia oyster. Maybe if you have your reaction in your chat, if you can raise your hand if you've heard of the Olympia oyster. I'm just curious. A couple people, couple shaking their heads. Well, actually, I was a biologist, a marine biologist on the coast for, I think only a couple people raised their hands, but yeah, you can put them down now. But not a ton of people had heard about it, which is not surprising because it's basically been functionally extinct in California for quite a while. It's the only native oyster to the US West Coast. It's found in bays and estuaries, and it forms complex structured habitats. Now, just one quick overview of its life cycle. You don't have to memorize this, but the important thing to note is that it fertilizes eggs, and then that larvae swims in the water column for up to 60 days. And this is really important for restoration, and I will get to why. But in Southern California and along the coast, it's basically depleted. We had over 90% loss of this species, and there was a combination of factors. So historically, it was harvested as a food source, dredging, pollution, habitat modification. Like I mentioned, kind of our bays and estuaries rarely look like they used to. We have a lot of coastal armoring, development, things have sort of changed and loss of habitat for the oyster. But there's restoration along the coast ongoing. Closest to some of you guys in Monterey would be Elkhorn Slough. There's a lot of native oyster restoration happening. The Elkhorn Slough National Ecological Research Reserve It's a really cool project that I encourage you to look up and check out if you're in the area, and Elkhorn Slough is just gorgeous to visit as well. But there are remnant populations along the coast, and it's not larval limited. So remember I said that it swims in the larval column for 60 days or so, and that is really critical. So even though it's almost functionally extinct, we have these remnant populations that if we build the right structure, we can get a larval supply coming in to settle in these bays. So our project doesn't do any seeding, we don't do any lab work or anything like that. We're using the natural population. Unfortunately, in Newport, we're not limited by that larvae. If we build the right habitat, we'll get the juvenile oysters coming in, which is good news for the population. So a little bit about our experimental design. So we have oysters and eelgrass restored together and separately. And this is kind of a schematic. So at 4 different sites, we have 4 different treatments. So a control mudflat where we haven't done anything, restored any species, an eelgrass restoration site with no oyster bed inshore of it, an oyster bed with no eelgrass offshore, and then species restored together. And the project is looking at how they interact and what kind of ecosystem benefits they provide separately and together. This is a picture of what that looked like in 2017. You can see kind of the oyster bed closer to the beach, and then the dark area, kind of the size of the scale of what the eelgrass looked like from above. This is another schematic just to kind of look at it to get a sense of size. Now, back in 2016, 2017, when we first planted this, you could take these aerial photos and see these nice, clean boxes of where we had restored eelgrass. Do you think it stayed like that? No, it didn't. So in good news and bad news, and I'm going to talk about how it's changed over time in the last kind of 3 or 4 years. So oyster restoration, I'm going to focus a little bit more about how we did it. So instead of, we didn't use any larvae, and instead of using plastic bags, we use this really unique material called coconut coir. And I'm going to show you some photos of what it looks like. And we used clean Zostera gigas shell. So that's the Pacific oyster that's much larger than the native Olympia oyster. And it's more like what you would see in a restaurant. And we used about 40,000 pounds of this, which may not seem like a lot. Some East Coast projects are on a really large scale using barges, but for me and our small scale project, this was a ton of shell and a really big effort. So our footprint was about 240 square meters, and we used about 250, 300 volunteers over the course of the project. And these oyster restoration sites were built in 2017. So a quick graphic. So just a little bit of what an oyster looks like inside. Many of you have maybe seen these at a restaurant, eaten them. But to study the method for restoring them, there was also some history. So I work a lot with a collaborator at Cal State Fullerton. Her name is Dr. Zackrell, as well as another collaborator at Cal State Long Beach, Dr. Whitcraft. And Dr. Zackrell in particular, over the course of several years, looked at the best way to restore oysters. And I just want you to focus kind of at the bottom of this graphic. So rather than putting out just loose shell that might get disturbed or sink in the mud, they found that when they consolidated or bagged it well, it would kind of stay together and stay at the right tidal height for the native oyster to settle. So how does that work in practice? So I mentioned this coconut coir material. A lot of oyster restoration projects on the East Coast will use plastic mesh. But at Coastkeeper, we really wanted to avoid that. So we're one of the first projects to use this biodegradable material. And so it was kind of challenging to figure out the best way to use it. What thickness did we want? How big was the mesh size? Would it work? Would they stay together? How do we, put them into bags to get them out on the field? So we had volunteers and they hand sewed over 500 bags. Our initial target was like 1,000, But we did a bunch of events with volunteers and community and got people to sew these bags, and we got to 500. And this is a little bit what a final oyster coir bag looked like. So we filled those with shell, and then those went out on the mud flat. We didn't have any kind of big equipment, barges. It was mainly all kind of hand transport via boat and trucks and volunteers. So a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, not a lot of blood, just sweat maybe, went into this project. And so it was really kind of community driven. A lot of different volunteers, students getting involved through the universities, our interns, and then our members from Coastkeeper and volunteers. So that was really fun to get the kind of community involved in different stages of the process via bag sewing, transport, and getting it out onto the mud. So what we did first was we laid down, we had some mussel shell. We actually purchased the shell that we used for the restoration from an aqua farm in Carlsbad. We're now working on collecting oyster shell from restaurants so that we can recycle it. But back then, to get this huge quantity, we actually purchased it from an aqua farm. And we had some mussel shell mixed in with that. So what we did is the first layer, we had a layer of coir, a layer of mussel shell, kind of like a quesadilla style. And then on top of that went all those hand sewn coir bags. The reason we did that is we didn't want everything sinking into the mud, because erosion, sediment deposition is always going to be a challenge at these sites because they're really soft, really thick mud. This is what it looked like kind of a one site completed. So those bags going into about a 20 meter by 1.5 meter restoration site. Fun challenge. We did this all at 3 and 4 in the morning because that's when the low tide was. So it was great to get volunteers out at that time because they're not doing anything else, right? You don't have any plans 3 or 4 in the morning other than sleep. So we got 250 people out, 150 people probably for those couple of days of restoration at the sites. And it went really well. So now we've got beds built. What do we do next? So monitoring. So one of the cool things about this project is that it's really collaborative. So alone at Coastkeeper, we really couldn't have tackled all of the research questions that we wanted to without partnering with universities, grad students, undergrads. So I mentioned those 2 big partners, Cal State Fullerton, Cal State Long Beach. We also partner with San Diego State and USC. And a bunch of different students have worked at various aspects of looking at how these habitats are changing both the biological community and the physical community. So every 6 months and year, post oyster and eelgrass restoration, we're looking at a variety of these parameters. We also had a student look at invertebrates, fish diversity and abundance, bird changes in behavior, visitation. Are they using these habitats newly? Is it changing visitation? And then physical factors. And that's been one that's been really challenging to answer and is taking kind of a long time to get the data that we need to really confidently say, are these restoration plots slowing down erosion? Are they changing the physical habitat? So we're addressing that through some new techniques with Cal State Long Beach, doing aerial imagery, actually via drones to look at fine scale changes in the shoreline profile. We're also doing some new work on water quality and human visitation, as well as a bunch of other parameters. So I'm not going to get into the results of all of these different things, but I'm going to kind of touch on a few of them, kind of our results high level to date. So each year we go out, or kind of 6 months, and each year we've gone out to look at how the oysters are performing. And this is led by my collaborator at Cal State Fullerton, Danielle Zackerl. And this is us out monitoring a site. So our next round of sampling will be in December. And we're still collecting data on oyster abundance, health, and how these beds have changed over time. So that we do that via quadrats. So you can see the picture in the middle. We actually take a fixed area and do point contact surveys, looking at everything that's in that plot to see what's changed over time. We also look at the mud condition. So how much shell do we have left? Is there more mud, less mud? Some of these kind of questions we're taking data on over time. Here are some results. So the graph on the x-axis, we have our 4 different sites. On the y-axis, we have oyster abundance. And you can see the colored bars represent our 4 treatments. So in the 2 treatments, the green and the purple, where we have oysters restored, you can see the abundance of oysters is much, much greater than the control mudflat where we haven't done any restoration. So 2 years post-restoration, we had oyster densities about 10 times what they would be occurring naturally. And after a couple of years, we had fused living oysters on several of the sites. So the goal is to these then be kind of self-sustaining populations. So you can see at this photo below, that's what a native oyster bed kind of should look like, where they're building, fusing on each other and becoming consolidated. That quar has broken down and you get kind of a consolidated structure. And after 3 years, we have kind of 2 of those great looking oyster beds at 2 of the sites. And they've kind of fluctuated over time. So what about the eelgrass? So this graphic shows you our eelgrass mapping in 2018, so about a year or 2 post restoration. So the brown boxes are kind of those initial plot areas, and the green is where the eelgrass expanded to. So our initial target restoration was 1,280 square meters. And in 2018, we had over 3,000 meters, or almost an acre. So about 3 times our initial target. Just this past year, our mapping efforts resulted in almost 4 acres. So about a year or 2 ago, we kind of gave up having those control plots because the eelgrass at 3 out of 4 of the sites just went everywhere. It has spread all over this main beach here. It's pretty much kind of covered the whole area, and we were no longer able to really maintain that experiment. So a little tricky because now we can't really say conclusively how the oyster beds are doing without eelgrass. But from a restoration perspective, it's great news because there really wasn't any eelgrass in this part of the bay prior to Coastkeeper's efforts. Now this is at 3 out of 4 of the sites. So the site on this graphic way up at the top, that site did not perform as well. So it's cut off from this picture because really it failed almost every year. So at 3 out of the 4 sites, gangbusters, eelgrass everywhere. And we're still trying to tease out why it didn't perform so well at that 4th site. It's a little bit further back in the bay. So it could be something with water circulation. It's a little bit different sediment type. The depth is a little bit different. So we're really trying to conclusively kind of still tease out what physical factors caused it not to do as well at that site. But great news, it's doing really well at 3 out of the 4 sites. So what else has kind of resulted from this? So now we have this structure where previously there was pretty much just a bare mud flat. So with that, you get all of these other invertebrates. So we've seen octopus, we've seen isopods, copepods, all kinds of different crustaceans, different invertebrates, that gooey, creepy, crawly stuff that I love, that all has really, really taken off at a lot of these sites. So mussels, sponges, scallops, all these things that probably wouldn't really like settling in just bare mud have now come in. However, with that said, that oyster bed does cover part of the mudflat. So one of our other studies is looking at underneath kind of pre and post oyster restoration, what does the species diversity do as far as invertebrates? So this is a project at Cal State Long Beach looking at diversity and abundance of the invertebrate community pre and post restoration. Because once you put shell down, that's going to kind of change that previous mud habitat. So what we basically think is, although you get a little bit of loss in the invertebrate community right as you restore kind of underneath the oyster beds themselves, taking into consideration the new eelgrass habitat and the overall community diversity, and still pretty good news like overall for the ecosystem. We also have a project looking at fish. So looking at how they're using the habitats and which are using them. So we've seen a lot of round rays. This is a bat ray. So that's another project that Cal State Long Beach is looking at is how do they use these different habitats? Are there more species, different species than we've seen before? And is this kind of increasing fish diversity? One challenge we had is that these sites are in an urban area. So that beach that I showed you with all the eelgrass is a site that's heavily used by recreational fishermen. So one of the problems we had early on was that fishermen were hooking those bags of coconut coir and pulling them up on the beach. So totally an unanticipated kind of thing with our project that we didn't really think about. So we had to kind of adapt and strategize. And so we got some additional signage there because it actually is a marine protected area that we're working in, but fishing from shore, hook and line, is allowed. So we just had to kind of go out on the beach and do some outreach in different languages. I bet some of the interpreters might be able to read this and maybe correct it. So it was definitely a challenge for us to reach these different target audiences that were utilizing the beach and explain to them the habitat benefits and how it will overall be great for the fishery. But if you could just, avoid these certain plots, that would be great. But our new strategy I'm going to talk about, we kind of avoided that problem with hooking the coir. So we kind of re-strategized. So in addition to that fishing disturbance, we had some other disturbance at one of the sites. Actually, someone was collecting shells from the beach, which is not allowed in a marine protected area. So one of our sites got really heavily disturbed. But even so, we had really high oyster densities on those kind of disturbed sites. So we didn't want to pack on shell right on top of them because we still had some living oysters there. So what we did in 2019 was we built some new kind of mini beds. And instead of hand sewing those individual bags that could be hooked by fishermen, we chose more of this burrito style that avoided that bag sewing and just kind of wrapped it in the field. So this is kind of what those look like. So still using clean Pacific oyster shell. And instead of individual bags, we wrapped the coir sort of kind of all around it. So it was one big piece. And these we actually put at 2 different tidal heights. So if we can look at how that might influence oyster abundances as well. Because one of our sites that performed really poorly as far as eelgrass went, performed really well as far as oyster abundances. And we think that might have something to do with the tidal height. So we're currently testing that more specifically with these kind of new mini beds. We're also looking at the coir breakdown, because as I said, this project is kind of new in using this material. So we got a lot of questions on how long does it last? How long does it break down? How do you use it? And so with these new mini beds, we're taking photo plots every 6 months so we can quantify that breakdown a little more. It actually lasted underwater a lot longer than I thought it would, over a year in some sites and even longer. So it's still kind of there. We're also looking at how the beds are shifting and changing over time. So one challenge that we had is kind of keeping this bed integrity. So the photo on the left is what a built site kind of looked like in 2017 with those individual bags and some loose shell. And then over the years, it started to break down and move and change. And how do we sort of adapt to that? Do we need to keep doing additional restoration? How long does that take? What factors are influencing it? So that's another one of our questions. And it's really varied based on our 4 sites. So the site at the middle, you can see a few years later, the shell is all still really consolidated, really intact, versus a different site where it's spread out a little bit more, migrated. So one of the other questions that we're also looking at is human visitation. So a couple of the sites are in heavily used recreational beaches, and one site is in an ecological reserve that's totally closed off to human access. So one of the graduate students at Cal State Fullerton is looking at if we can quantify that. Is that really having an influence, just that presence on the beach? Beds at all of the sites have also migrated upshore, except for one. So on the left, if you can see at the front, there's PVC pipes kind of upwards to the left of the people. And if you see where those pipes are on the right, the oyster bed is totally shifted upshore. And so we're now kind of also measuring that and tracking that, as well as one more question or factor that could or could not be important in the future. And then, as I mentioned, there's a lot of still unanswered questions. This is a multi-year project. We're really looking at how we can extend the monitoring timeline to get funding and really study this over time so that we can be confident that we've collected enough data to demonstrate success, and then really transfer this knowledge to other sites. So how can this be implemented at other sites? What does it cost? What are the best practices? And so kind of that's where we're heading with the project. So with that, I want to thank a lot of my collaborators, particularly Cal State Fullerton, Cal State Long Beach, our funding sources. And then I have one more slide. Two more slides. I debated talking about this and giving a whole talk about this, but recently in Southern California, we discovered a new invasive algae. It's called Caulerpa prolifera, and it's really unlikely that it'd be up in Monterey. But I just wanted to highlight that and show you guys, just in case folks out there are divers or snorkelers or visiting places on the coast. It's a new invasive species that we recently discovered, and Coastkeeper was part of the effort to survey for it, remove it, make sure it's not spreading to other areas. And Department of Fish and Wildlife has a website to report it if you've seen it, and kind of a unique thing just to be aware of for folks kind of in the marine realm. And with that, we'll take any questions.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Totally admire the fact that you refused to get the plastic netting. Went with the coconut coir. That makes me so happy. Students, please go ahead and use the raise hand function if you'd like to ask a question or put your question in the chat. I don't see anything yet. I think people are just still percolating, but
I know it's kind of a lot of info to cover, but
let's go.
Marissa and Alex have raised their hands.
Yeah, great. Oh, I'm so sorry. And I need to, now you will be able to unmute yourself. There you go.
Let's go, Marissa, and then Alex. Yeah.
All right. Hi. I apologize for any background noise. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. This hits really close to home. I'm actually from Costa Mesa, California, and grew up going and doing like field trips to the Upper Newport Bay and all of that. So hearing about in those field trips, like the oyster restoration projects, but not fully knowing what was going on, and then being able to be here now and get the full, like, from beginning to where you're at now with it is just amazing. Finally, all those questions that I've had growing up are answered. So thank you. That's all I wanted to say. It's just really cool, and I really admire the work you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we have opportunities to get involved on our website. We do monthly beach cleanups. I didn't mention the oil spill at all, but we've been tracking information, resources around that. So if you're ever in the area, and then if you're not, even just check out if there's a local waterkeeper organization or, you know, beach cleanups. There's ways to get involved, and we have internships as well. So yeah.
All right, Alex, you're up.
All right, hi. Thanks for an awesome presentation. As someone who's worked with volunteers before, I'm insanely impressed and jealous that you got like 150 people at a beach at like 4 a.m. And I mean, especially for a project where something like that amount of person power is kind of essential. I'm curious what strategies, like the thinking from the beginning of, are we going to build this to require volunteers? And then that's such a big part. Then how do you actually make that happen and get the things in the water?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there was a lot of kind of volunteer effort even prior to getting out on the mud. So we worked with Girl Scouts, we worked with a guarded group to sew the bags. We did an event at a brewery, Sip and See. Bag quality went down a little bit, but the fun level went up. And then for getting a lot of the other volunteers out, we worked with the universities. So fortunately, we had 2 professors that were involved with the project that had students in some of their marine ecology classes. And so a couple of those got extra credit. So that was one way we got a lot of students involved. I would say working with universities and students was how we got a lot of our volunteer base. But Coastkeeper in general does a lot more general volunteering with like beach cleanups and things like that. So through social media, advertising, that's another way to recruit folks. But for the specific mud work as well, it's kind of a certain kind of person that wants to come out and do that and that can do it physically. So that limited us a little bit, but we did get some people that were really keen to help out. And so that was really amazing to see.
Cool, thank you.
Ben, I think you're up.
Yeah, thank you for a great presentation. I just had a quick question about the oysters. I don't know much about oyster biology, obviously, but is it really just a case of if you build it, they will come? Like you don't need live oysters, just put the shells in there and the larvae will show up themselves?
Yeah, so in some places on the coast, they are a little bit limited by the amount of larvae in the water column. My collaborator at Cal State Fullerton is actually tracking the larvae in the water and settlement via these ceramic tiles. So we're actually looking at settlement and recruitment of juvenile oysters at the sites. Fortunately, Newport has enough population that gets into the bay that we're not limited by larvae. But there's some new projects that are working with aquaculture. A couple projects with Sea Grant and one out of Elkhorn Slough that is looking at how we can use aquaculture in native oyster restoration. But Coastkeeper, yeah, it's all just natural, building the right habitat because they can settle on anything. They can settle on rocks and pier pilings, but they really like to settle on the shells of other oysters. They get some chemical cues and that structure is really complex. And so particularly if you're using shell for restoration, you know, it kind of can perpetuate and create its own habitat.
Gotcha. Thank you. That's fascinating.
Hey, Katie, I have a couple quick questions, but first I'll just say I was really impressed by kind of the thoroughness of the kind of the design and the research that went with it. It wasn't just a kind of haphazard, we'll throw an oyster reef together. You all really kind of did a comprehensive kind of project there, and it's really impressive. And my question is, obviously there's coastkeepers all over the country, and I'm just wondering, are your efforts kind of scaling up to the other organizations, and are there policies within the organization to really make these type of projects a core component and really scale them? Because the reason I ask is because we're finding in our work that these things are quite economic and they're quite effective, but it's the demonstration projects and the knowledge and people getting used to them that's the real thing. And coastkeepers could play such a key role in that, if all over the country there was projects like this going on.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Each of the keeper chapters is pretty unique. We all kind of have different areas of focus. There is another oyster restoration project hopefully happening in San Diego. There's a big living shoreline project in San Francisco, led more on the kind of academic side. But yeah, it's really just a matter of being from a nonprofit, gaining the funding. So if that's kind of considered a priority by state and government agencies, then restoration can be promoted. then small nonprofits can apply for those grants. So we were pretty lucky to be supported by the State Coastal Conservancy and a couple other private foundations. And that really helped it get off the ground. And then those partnerships sort of leveraging, student efforts on the research also really helped us to tackle a lot more questions than we could have, just as our small nonprofit.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. And I hope I hope we get some money in the Build Back Better, and I hope it gets into your coffers.
And we're hoping to publish a little bit more. We have one paper looking at scalability of restoration, and then we're hoping, for some more kind of eventual publications of the work, and that can help, disseminate information too.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think there's a question here, Maya, in the chat. I don't know, Maya, do you want to say it? Or I can read it out.
I can read it.
Okay.
She's asking about competition patterns between native and non-native oysters. She's from the Humboldt Bay area where majority of California oyster industry resides. So we have Pacific oysters, that big oyster that we're using the bare shell for restoring the native Olympia oyster, which is much smaller. And what my collaborator at Cal State Fullerton found was that if you build the restoration site at the right tidal height, then you avoid some of that competition. So they have a little bit of stratification in the water column where those bigger Pacific oysters can handle heat stress and being out of the water longer. And so the lower tidal height is where we've built the Olympia oysters, and we're not seeing a lot of non-natives, which is good. But we definitely keep an eye out for them because they can definitely outcompete. And some restoration projects, particularly on the East Coast, are looking at restoring Pacific oysters because they're much larger and they can filter water. So there's a project in New York called the Billion Oyster Project, really cool one on improving water quality, where the goal isn't really so much, ecosystem benefits or, habitat stabilization. It's more about water quality. So it's kind of a variety of oyster restoration projects out there.
Awesome. Yeah, we love the Billion Oyster Project in New York. That's a great one. Yeah. Any other questions here? Anyone, you can just unmute yourself again or put it in the chat there for Katie.
Well, I'll jump in while people are thinking of their question. Katie, if you had a blank check, if we get our $10 billion into the Build Back Better, and they say, Katie Nichols, you can have as much as you want to do what you want with, what would you change? How would you blank check do this project?
That's a good question. I would probably scale up. So we have another project in Alamitos Bay. It's challenging to find the right habitats because obviously eelgrass restoration won't work everywhere. It only worked at 3 out of 4 of our sites. Oyster restoration isn't a solution, in every bay. But looking at ways that you can promote more natural seascapes versus hard structures, and working with engineers and policymakers so that we can adapt those projects. But maybe if it's not, totally a natural seascape, it can incorporate some of those ideas. So some projects in San Francisco have looked at, if you have a seawall, is there a way to make it living? Is there a way to provide habitat benefits and meet somewhere in the middle? But yeah, it's a good question. Promote restoration and advocacy and clean water all along the coast. Get people involved in their watersheds and the specific things happening in their area as far as water quality goes. I think that's also a big, effort as well as education. But unspecific, all over the place.
It's not usually a problem scientists and nonprofits have, but I hope it's a problem that you have. And a second question or thought, you're answering really specific scientific questions about the changes in the physical, the fish species, the plant species, water quality. have you considered building in an economic question, a money question? Of course, Center for the Blue Economy, we're thinking about those type of questions. But in future projects, if there's a way to put the valuation on kind of the tourist dollar or the before and after economically, just a thought.
Yeah, I think also more agencies should have invasive species response programs too. With the Callirpa invasion, that was something that was really a success and a big challenge, because there was a federal agency team that had worked on a different species of Callirpa, and they kind of came together really quickly. But a lot of those agencies don't have any specific funding for staff to work on those issues. And so things had to be, shifted around. And so I think as much as we can kind of promote conservation organizations to sort of have some of those backups would be a good idea as well. Yeah. And being prepared for climate change is another big one.
Indeed.
Yeah. I put our website in the chat, and then I was going to show a quick video, but I think we kind of, it kind of runs over a little bit of what I talked about, but just some more visuals. But that's something on YouTube you can check out if you want to check it out. And Coastkeeper has a whole kind of YouTube channel on our website, and our contact information is on there as well, so folks can check that out.
Nice. Well, we do have a few minutes more till the 7 o'clock hour if there are any final questions. So anybody there want to ask our resident living shoreline expert here?
Sure, I'll actually ask a question. I'm just curious, because I'm also from the Orange County area, born and raised in Tustin. I'm just curious what other organizations you all partner with in the Orange County area and what that looks like. Specifically, if you have any groups that you're working with in Laguna Beach. I'm on the Sustainability Council for the city. And we're just always looking for, different groups to bring in, different people to come do speaking events, et cetera, et cetera. So just curious who you're involved with. And thank you again for the talk.
Yeah. So we partner a lot with the Laguna Ocean Foundation. And that's a local group that does a lot of tide pool education. So that's one specifically to check out. We partner a little bit with OC Habitats. There's a couple, there's called Orange County Environmental Justice. That's another group we're starting to partner with a bit more to look at how we can bring programming to kind of underserved populations. Those are some big ones. Orange County also has a marine protected area collaborative. It's called OC Impact, or OC Marine Protected Area Collaborative. And there's several of those collaboratives along the coast. There's one in Monterey. And so those groups kind of bring together stakeholders in the marine protected area process. So researchers, fishermen, state and local government folks, and they look at education, research, compliance with MPAs. So that's definitely another good resource in Orange County too, is the Marine Protected Area Collaborative.
Awesome, those are great resources. Right, any other questions here, either in the chat or just speak up? Going once, going twice. All right, Katie. Well, look, that was really fascinating. It was great to get some kind of real on the ground details about this, and we obviously wish you a lot of luck with that. And we will be in touch if we see some funding, and maybe we could work together and do some of the economics, as Rachel mentioned, on a project and kind of try to build that in. I think that would be really fascinating. So thanks so much for taking the time, and good luck with everything, and have a great rest of your week. And everybody else, have a great rest of your evening. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.